I'm Elizabeth Burr, and we're so glad that so many of you could join us today. I wanted to give a bit of background in case you're not familiar with REL West. The REL West English Learner Alliance has been working with the State Departments of Education in our region to provide research reports and technical assistance on the topics most pressing to them in order to improve outcomes for English learner students. And because the topics of English learners with disabilities and long-term English learner students have risen to the top, we've also developed webinars in these two areas in order to support practitioners as well. We're so grateful to have such knowledgeable presenters here to speak with you today, Leslie Hamburger and Juile Goldman. The goals for the webinar today are as follows. We are going to explore promising practices and strategies that support the needs of English learners and LTELs in particular, and understand the importance of coordinating these practices. As we get started, I wanted to signal for you what's to come. So each presenter will share an overarching frame or approach grounded in research, and then discuss specific strategies or practices aligned with that approach. Leslie will describe an apprentice model, and Julie will discuss a frame, which is the writing process itself. Some of the strategies may well be what you are already doing in your districts and classrooms. But what Leslie and Julie will convey is the importance of implementing them in a coordinated, cohesive way that is aligned with a particular frame. As you listen, I encourage you to think about how their work fits with what you are already doing and what some gaps might be, and how consideration of the strategies and practices within an aligned approach might fill these gaps.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to join you today to discuss the learning opportunities offered English learners, and in particular students who, despite 6 or more years of schooling, are not making adequate progress in developing conceptual, analytic, and linguistic practices to succeed in school and career. So I want to start off by really posing some overarching ideas that we really need to hold dear. And it is that regardless of their level of proficiency or academic or language development, all English learners really possess immense potential, incredibly valuable resources that they bring to school. They have a deep knowledge of their family languages, of their backgrounds, of their cultures, and they really bring an incredible potential to be realized in our school settings. So our role as educators is really to set forth for them a path, a vision for who they are going to be, who they are going to grow, to develop, and how do we scaffold their deep and accelerated growth. It is our role to really foster the development of multilingual, multiliterate individuals to the betterment of our society. And so with that premise in mind, we really need to think about our English learners, all of them, with a very proleptic stance, not for who they are today, but who they will become. And through these stages of language acquisition, from beginning with newcomers, then moving students promptly into beginning English language development stages, intermediate English language development, advanced English language development, and then, aha, we've reached redesignation and our students are fully proficient. Well, the reality is not so nice and neat. It really doesn't move in this lockstep, and it's not a progression that is even, as you all well know. In order for this reality to occur, this picture, this myth that we have of the development of students, we really need some conditions. And these conditions, unfortunately, are not always present in our education settings and in our schools. So I wanted to talk a little about the conditions. So in order to have that nice, linear, strong progression in growth in our English learners, we really need a process of apprenticeship in which English learners are invited to apprentice next to more capable peers, more capable adults who can guide them and engage them in the disciplinary practices and move them along a continuum from apprenticeship to appropriation, We need learning experiences that simultaneously develop conceptual, analytic, and language practices. And this is a key point with long-term English learners that we'll explore a little more further down the road in this webinar. That we will have masters that can model the practices that the English learners will need to engage in, and that we really take advantage of deliberate and varied heterogeneous grouping. So all of these conditions, unfortunately, are not always present in our school settings, and therefore it points against that nice progression in language acquisition that leads to redesignation. And then the final point I wanted to make is that really, even when all of these conditions are in place, we really need to think that the development of practices, whether disciplinary practices or language practices or analytical practices, is really a lifelong process. So even though the title for the webinar talks about the mastery for English learners, we become increasingly more proficient, but we never reach an end point in the development of our knowledge. And so that mastery idea is also a misnomer that I think is something to consider. So I wanted to talk about what are the actual qualities of the types of learning opportunities that English learners need in order to accelerate their development. And even if we can't meet that myth of that smooth transition from language level to language level, at least what really allows us to develop and accelerate students' growth there are four conditions that we really need to think about, or four elements, quality elements about opportunities to learn for English learners. And those have to do with the academic rigor of the engagements that we invite students into. So for English language learners, they need to engage from day one in deep generative learning opportunities that really build interconnections across ideas, where students are engaged in high challenge experiences coupled by high levels of support, where students participate in abundant opportunities with peers for quality interactions, where they engage in sustained oral interactions that are reciprocal, that build knowledge, and where we attend to language every day. We look at language from the larger perspective. So the purposes in using language, the look of language as genre that is purposeful, that has patterns, that really develops students' understandings of the text in our discipline. We tend to focus on language with language learners too much at the more atomistic pieces of language, and that misses the opportunity that they need for learning. So what happens when we provide opportunities that are not incorporating these requirements that I just described? What happens to English learners is that they're really disinvited. They are turned off. They are delegitimized. We end up not only not rethinking our instruction, but we end up isolating them, putting them in separate classes. We give them a sort of unsolicited, a not very solicitous term, long-term ELs, and we tend to propose remediation. And in all honesty, that is the wrong approach. What in fact students need is the greater depth, greater engagement, and definitely acceleration. English language learners who have been in school for 6 or more years, and these definitions vary by state and by district and by school in many cases, who have been in school for 6 or more years, who have developed oral language proficiency but seem to stall or underperform in reading or writing, and who most often have limited L1 literacy skills. We've been labeled them as long-term English learners. And In some instances, in some states, we are located in California, but this is the case in other states as well, as many as 75% of secondary English language learners can be classified as long-term ELs. So this is a growing population of students. It's a population that we need to really think carefully about the design of their instruction as they are expanding and we are not meeting their needs very well. So I want to shift and talk about what should it look like. What is the model for the type of instruction that can support these long-term English learners and that can develop their proficiency, both conceptually, analytically, and linguistically. So I want you to think about how do you design instruction that takes on an apprenticeship approach? How do we design instruction that is high challenge and high support? Because all English learners, and long-term English learners in particular, really need ambitious, well-scaffolded learning opportunities to develop their potential. Their learning has to occur beyond their present level of performance, and they need to be supported to engage in the kinds of disciplinary practices that they will need in college and career and beyond. And so the work needs to be of very high challenge, but with high levels of support. Students who are intellectually challenged will develop linguistic, conceptual, and academic autonomy over time. One of the challenges of working with long-term English learners, as you know, is that long-term ELs tend to feel disengaged. They are unmotivated about participating in school in many cases because for the longest time they have been disinvited, as I mentioned before. And so learning to hook them back into schooling really requires that we think about instruction that is of high interest and it's a high challenge and that is appropriate for adolescents. Because long-term ELs typically are located in middle school and high school. In some instances, some fifth grade students might be classified as long-term ELs, but in general, it's secondary students. And so working with students in those age groups in content and activities and practices that are not taking into account their interests, their prior experiences, their knowledge, is really shooting ourselves in the foot, to be honest. So that's something that we need to really think about. The shifts in instruction, in design and in pedagogy that teachers of long-term ELs need to think about are many, but I want to highlight from this slide and the next one, which refers to these shifts, a couple of things. And one is the idea that as we engage with long-term ELs, we really need to think about, reconceptualize our understanding of what language acquisition includes, involves, and requires. We need to think about language acquisition not as an individual process, but really about a process of social apprenticeship. Language acquisition develops as students engage with others in disciplinary uses of language. And so as we conceptualize instruction, we've got to really think differently about how we design learning experiences for students, and we require students to use academic uses of language. And then the second thing that I've alluded to before, but that I think is an important point to think about, is that educators need to reconsider the idea of seeing language acquisition as a linear, progressive process. That really language acquisition is much more complex. It is nonlinear. It takes a few steps forward and a few steps back. It is circular at times. So our design of instruction needs to take that into account and build on that rather than try to fight that process. When we looked at the myth of language progression and development earlier on, a few slides back, one of the misconceptions about that process of language acquisition is the belief that students will progress like year by year from one level to the next. And the reality is that the language demands in the earlier levels of language acquisition are less, and so students tend to progress faster through the first levels of language acquisition. And also, as students grow older and get into higher grade levels, the language demands of the higher levels, intermediate and above, and the language demands of their disciplinary courses increase exponentially. So students will grow much slower at those levels and will struggle to make progress year by year. So that's something that we need to really consider. We really need a future-oriented pedagogy in which we engage students in instruction where participation is at the center of students' development. Participation in activity is key for the development of knowledge. So our very first charge with working with long-term ELs needs to be to engage them meaningfully in disciplinary activity, and that we engage them in processes of apprenticeship into disciplinary practices so that they move from being novices to increasingly more levels of competence in being able to use disciplinary ideas, habits of mind, language, to construct arguments, to read complex texts, to present their ideas orally and in writing, and that the process is a process of apprenticeship. You engage in the activities, and over time you become increasingly more sophisticated in able to participate in these processes and practices. And that we design instruction that is high challenge and high support, that honors students' capabilities. Honestly, if we got to summarize it in some way for long-term ELs, the key of our work with long-term ELs needs to focus on providing students with intellectual push. That's really what we need to be working on. But how do we make that happen? So the first thing I want to talk about or say is that you got to think about language development and academic uses of English as moving along a continuum from more spoken-like uses of language to more written-like uses of language. And so in the design of instruction, we need to work with English learners so that they're able to, within units, within lessons even, they are able to move from more spoken-like to more written-like uses of language. And so in this design, in this model, the role of oracy, oral language use, oral language production, is central. It's pivotal, because oral language production is going to support students in their acquisition of academic uses of English. Because it enables students to move between everyday uses of language and more specialized uses of language in the disciplines, because it helps students appropriate disciplinary knowledge in English, and it invites students to test hypotheses and to serve as like auto input and correction. So the role of oracy is at the center of the development of academic uses of English. So as you think about the instruction of English learners, you've got to think about how do you construct learning experiences where they are engaging with each other, with the teacher, and in oral and written ways 80–90% of their time. So I've given you sort of an intro to the frame and to what we are thinking as a model for how to design instruction. And I want to go to sharing a specific example, because it will allow us to talk about details of a lesson in particular. And so I'm going to talk about an example from our collaboration with a school in Austin, Texas, and a teacher at that time and administrator at this point. In fact, she was an administrator at that time as well. She was an assistant principal at the school, a vice principal. But she taught a class. And so what is interesting about this example is that this school in Texas really changed the paradigm for how they would work with long-term ELs. And so they moved away from a point of thinking about ELs as requiring remediation and being stigmatized as being behind and inadequate. And they really tried to change the paradigm so that it was a view of acceleration and pride. So one of the changes they did is that they identified their long-term ELs and they recruited them very purposefully into high-interest elective courses. And those elective courses were designed with the intent to engage students in deep and robust work that focused not on the isolated pieces of language, but actually focused on robust ideas, intellectual processes, habits of mind, developing substantive uses of language and literacy skills. They went from sort of promoting, or really nobody wants to promote failure, but accepting failure, to treating students as very talented, very capable, and they really managed to convey that feeling through these elective courses and through the programs they started in their school. And so they shifted the adults' mindset from blaming the students for what they didn't have to really thinking about how to challenge and support the students. So in Ms. Crescenzi's class, I'm going to talk about a lesson in particular that she was doing. And so this class, the elective designed for these students was a psychology class. And so she used high-interest material around psychology to help students to engage in reading with complex texts, writing extensively, and really developing understanding of language and how language works. And so I want to talk about this lesson that she implemented. And what you have in front of you in the screen right now is a trajectory of this lesson. So students were to engage in a series of activities in reading and discussion in preparation for writing and informational text. And so I'm going to walk us quickly through some of the elements of this lesson and discuss how this lesson models the idea of apprenticing students into disciplinary uses of language, apprenticing students into the academic practices that they will need, and how do you design high challenge and high support learning experiences. So the first task that the students engaged in groups, in their base groups, was an extended anticipatory guide. In the extended anticipatory guide, students were able to do either in pairs or in groups of 4, depending on the amount of support that students needed. So there were a series of 5 statements that students had to agree or disagree with those statements, and initially at the beginning of the lesson. And at the end, they would come back after the lesson to review those opinions based on the evidence that they had collected throughout the lesson and to identify their findings. And so in order to do this task, there were 2 models that you could use for the task. One model was with moderate levels of scaffolding, where students in a group of 4, every student read their statements and responded to their opinion, agree or disagree silently. And then they shared using a round-robin format, each student sharing their opinion for each one of the statements, and then having a general discussion at the end. So that was a moderate level of scaffolding. The other groups of students who maybe required more intense support completed the anticipatory guide with a partner. And they had a series of formulaic expressions that they could use to get started in a conversation with their partner. So the formulaic expressions went something like, I'll read statement 1, and the student had to read statement 1, and I think this, what do you think? And so there was this sort of support for engaging students in a discourse about the statements to help them think through and begin to explore what their opinions were in preparation for this lesson. So from the statements, you are going to see that the lesson is going to really be about exploring the results of brain injuries and understanding how the brain is constructed and how the different functions occur throughout different parts of the brain, and how injuries to the brain can have an impact on people's behavior, physical appearance, mental processes, and so forth. So the way the lesson was structured was that students were engaged in a jigsaw. So they started off in heterogeneous groups, and they did a couple of activities. The anticipatory guide was one of those. And then they would move into expert groups where they were going to read a specific and become an expert on a specific case on a reasonably famous person who had suffered a brain injury. And so the cases were high interest. They were some pretty gory, frankly, to try to catch students' attention. They were cases that in some instances students might have had some prior experiences with, and they were definitely of different lengths and levels of difficulty to allow for the expert groups to maybe be more homogeneous in nature, to support students who had more similar reading abilities or language proficiency levels or so forth. So students engaged in looking at the texts very deeply, but in particular they were looking at focusing on language and genre. So the focus was really on the macro aspects of language. They were looking at the genre of these excerpts and cases that they were going to read, the purpose of why the author was writing in this way, what were the structural features of this genre, what were the intentions of the writer, what were the expectations of the reader, and then only after looking at that did they look at more micro elements of the language in terms of how the text was structured or how were certain linguistic choices made, and very, very late sort of look at words and vocabulary. So how do you engage English learners with complex texts? So basically we think we have two approaches. One approach is to engage students by using elements of scaffolding, using pedagogical scaffolding to support English learners to engage with complex texts. And the other element is to really work on engineering texts to make them more accessible for English learners initially. And so as a ramp up and into sort of grade level and beyond grade level texts that students might not be fully ready to engage with at that moment. And so this particular lesson will illustrate both elements of how to engage English learners using pedagogical scaffolding and also text engineering. So the cases that the students will read, I'll share in a minute, but let me unpack a little of how they will do the reading. So the first activity we discussed was the anticipatory guide to activate prior knowledge, to generate some interest in the experiences, to try to hook students into the ideas of the lesson. Then they were going to read a case with their expert group, and as they read, they're going to use this clarifying bookmark that you're seeing on your screen. And so the clarifying bookmark is trying to help students, to apprentice students into what good readers do. So it's giving students what they can do as a reader, and it gives them on the other side language that they can use with their partner to out loud carry out that reading strategy. So students read in pairs. The reader reads a section or a paragraph, and then the reader uses the clarifying bookmark to talk out loud about what they just read. And so they have to signal the strategy so that the activity is a metacognitive activity, so that the students begin to appropriate the practices we want them to be developing. We want to make sure that the activity is metacognitive. So we want students to signal, I am going to think about what this text means, or I'm going to summarize, or I'm going to make a connection and use my prior knowledge to help me understand. So students really have to speak out loud and signal what they are doing before actually using the formulaic expressions to do it orally. So students in pairs go back and forth reading actively, really unpacking and making sense of the texts that they are reading. That's what we mean as an activity that it supports students to engage in challenging activity, and that it's a form of scaffolding for engaging students in complex text. The other component, which I mentioned before, was the idea of engaging students with texts that have been engineered. So the 4 cases that students are going to read about are coming up. I'm going to be showing you these slides, and these are snapshots of those texts. And so if you look at this first one, the text has a series of features that have been added to make it more accessible for English learners. So there are pictures, there are captions, there are subheadings, there are focus questions, there's a space on the page for students to annotate and make connections and basically speak to the text as they read. All of these features were added to make the text more accessible for students. And because we were thinking about more homogeneous groups, the different cases will have different levels of engineering done to them so that we can adjust and differentiate for different levels of students. Because not always do you have a class where every student is an English learner, or not always do you have a class where you have students at the same language proficiency level. Most often, most of us will have pretty heterogeneous classes. So the texts have been engineered for different levels to allow for differentiation for different students. So these slides show how the text begins to change as we move forward in different, less scaffolding, less engineering as the text progresses. So students read and discuss with their expert group on a series of focus questions, and then they return to their base group to share their experiences. Based on this sharing of their experiences, then they synthesize their knowledge to begin to prepare their writing assignment. I wanted to close with this transcript. It's a piece of a transcript from this class, because one of the things that we struggle with English learners and long-term ELs is their perception of why they already know English. Why do I have to do this? And this oppositional, confrontational issue, it comes up often. So this is a direct quote from our students in this class, and the teacher is really struggling to bring them along to understand the need for engaging with language deeply. So I want to close by saying that if we teach today's students as we taught yesterday's, as John Dewey says, we really rob them of tomorrow. So I want to encourage you to think about the design of instruction that apprentices students into high challenge and high support work.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. This really dovetails what I'm going to be talking about with these 6 high leverage practices. They dovetail so perfectly with the apprenticeship model that Leslie was just talking about. So we'll see a lot of connection and overlap here. So why should we focus on writing? According to David Conley, he's from the University of Oregon, he said, if we could institute only one change to make students more college ready, it should be to increase the amount and quality of writing students are expected to produce. And the research shows that teacher knowledge is what most impacts writing achievement for long-term English learners. As teachers adjust to the changes with the new Common Core text types, we're grappling with and trying to understand the range of writing. So you can see that there in the purple, the role technology plays in the writing process, and the increased emphasis on research writing in the Common Core. So what we're going to be discussing, really, this is the context, the broader context for these practices. In his book, Creating Innovators, Tony Wagner stresses the need for students to be able to reason, analyze, hypothesize, weigh evidence, and really comprehend what they're reading. These concepts here that you see on the screen, summarizing, synthesizing, comparing, contrasting, these are really the foundations for Common Core thinking. In a nutshell, writing makes thinking visible. We can see what our students know through their writing. Here's our working definition of academic literacy. Academic literacy includes the cognitive, intangible skills involved in reading and writing, as well as the integrative role of academic oral language. In having a shared understanding of what we mean by quality instruction is where we can begin to improve teaching and learning in the K-12 system. So when we ask, where do teachers need to focus our instructional efforts to prevent and support long-term English learners, we can find our answers in these reviews of the literature. And here are some of the answers. We know that writing is complex, and so is writing instruction, and this research underscores the need for 6 key practices: to teach genre writing as a process, to build on students' backgrounds, model writing for and with our students, to develop their academic oral language and teach grammar and vocabulary explicitly and in the context. And by context, we mean the context of the student's reading and the context of the student's writing. So in the example that Leslie gave just a few minutes ago, it would be teaching the grammar and vocabulary within that article that they're working on. So now let's take a look at how we put the research into practice. So the first high leverage practice is teaching genre writing as a process. We know that genres function as frames for the ways we act, the thoughts we have, and the interactions we engage in. We need to provide long-term English learners with a pathway to acquire the genre proficiency to write successfully in the text types or genre families. Breaking down each text type into smaller linguistic parts is absolutely key for long-term English learners. And this has been discussed in the literature internationally from researchers on second language writing and from around the world. When we teach writing genres as isolated thinking constructs, meaning going back to those critical thinking skills of describing, comparing, contrasting, evaluating, and reasoning, we prepare long-term English learners for the demands of college and career writing, where they will ultimately blend all of these ways of thinking. But we need to first teach them as discrete skills. Too often, writing instruction starts with a prompt and an outline. In order to teach writing and not simply assign writing, we need to spend the majority of our time in that blue strand that you see there in that pre-writing process. Introducing the genre, unpacking the genre, and collaborating on writing. And as Leslie mentioned, that this is a nonlinear, this is a recursive. There is a flow to it, but we're moving along and constantly spiraling back to check for understanding with our students. And this is at the unit level. And so the example that Leslie just gave would be an example of a lesson within collaborating on writing. So in this approach, we're using writing to drive the entire instructional process over several weeks. I mean, this entire process may take 4 or 6 weeks to go through. Writing is not an add-on, but it's the driver of the instruction. So let's take a closer look here at how practices 2 through 6 are nested within practice number 1, to teach genre writing as a process. So the practices here are in red so that you can see how they fit into this overall amplified writing process. The first step of the writing process is to introduce the writing genre. So you can see that in the green in the upper left-hand side. In this phase, teachers collect baseline writing data, introduce the analytic rubric, and make connections to the genre. In the second phase of the pre-writing process, we unpack and model the writing. We'll talk much more about this in just a minute. The third phase of the pre-writing process, this is the phase where the majority of your instructional time will take place. This is the collaborating on writing. This is where the whole apprenticeship idea that Leslie was talking about fits so beautifully. In this phase, students read and analyze text. They take a look at those micro and macro aspects of the text, engage in meaningful academic dialogue around the text, and they collaborate together in pairs or small groups on the writing genre itself. This is where you're going to be pulling out all of the strategies that you already know, from reciprocal teaching to jigsawing. You're going to be pulling out all of these different strategies that you're familiar with in a multifaceted manner to work with your students. And together with their teacher and their peers, students, once they've gone through this multi-layered process in the collaborating on writing, students are ready to draft their own writing in this genre. So you've checked for understanding multiple times, and you know that each of your students is ready now for their individual writing. So this next phase is drafting, and students draft, and then they go on to revising. And this is, well, the drafting is also where we're going to collect their post-writing. So it is a type of a formative assessment. You do the pre-writing, the baseline in introducing the genre, and then that midway assessment, raw student writing in the drafting phase. And once you've checked, you start to score their writing. You engage in the revision process. And this is where, as teachers, we want to employ a growth mindset by providing additive feedback to our long-term English learners. And we're asking ourselves, when we're looking at their writing, what can this student do? Even if we know that they still have a ways to go to be grade level proficient, if we're beginning with that growth mindset and we look at their writing additively, we can build on where they are to bring them closer to proficiency. And we're using formative data to inform our own classroom instruction. Finally, we take the final writing to publishing, which is in itself another high leverage practice that we'll address momentarily. For long-term English learners, it's particularly important to use an analytic rubric as opposed to a more abstract holistic rubric. Analytic rubrics include clear, concrete criteria that can easily be turned into learning intentions or success criteria. So consider this. What are you already doing to teach this amplified integrated writing process, including building on students' backgrounds, modeling writing form with students, engaging in meaning-making, developing academic oral language and teaching grammar and vocabulary within the context of their own reading and writing, and ultimately publishing student writing. When you begin to use practice number 1 as an organizational framework, as these science teachers have done here in this photo, teachers can map on all the great resources in learning that we already have to these research practices. And so in the very beginning, when we were talking about the need to align our instruction in a coordinated, cohesive way, this is where we begin. And it also ties in with the work is these science teachers, they had been trained in a lot of project-based learning, and so they put all their training around project-based learning in that collaborative writing phase, because that's where their students will be engaging in those projects. The next high leverage practice is building on students' backgrounds. Research shows that building on students' background knowledge maximizes learning. So one way to connect with students' backgrounds is to connect the genre with current events. Here on the screen, you can see a few free or very affordable resources to support news in the classroom. To master something as complex as academic writing, students need models. Modeling writing for and with students is the third high-leverage practice. When teachers share their metacognitive process with students, we don't tell our students how to write, we show them how we write. And actually, I always tell teachers that if we're going to make only one change to our writing instruction, research shows that modeling, deconstructing and reconstructing language and structure is the most powerful of all of the practices. It's also probably the most difficult, as we found in our recent IES study. But when teachers put the effort in this area, it really reaps huge rewards. So modeling writing effectively involves beginning with the end in mind. What is it that I want my students, what kind of writing do I want them to produce? When teachers model how to think like a writer or a historian or a scientist and unpack our own writing process with our students, including the language and structure of our own writing, and then when we're doing these kinds of models, we're also demonstrating the risk-taking inherently involved in sharing writing with others. It is while we're doing this and engaging with our students that we demystify this messy and recursive process of writing. The next high leverage practice is developing academic oral language. And this is, as Leslie mentioned, where we're moving towards more specialized disciplinary language. All learning floats on a sea of talk. So here are some suggestions for engaging students in academic conversations. I've bolded Socratic seminars, as you can see, because too often we reserve Socratic seminars for our AP students, and yet we know from practice that long-term English learners thrive when they engage in these structured, dynamic discussions, these high-challenge activities, as Leslie mentioned, with support. This is where that concept of engagement, depth, and acceleration definitely ties in. When teachers provide opportunities to focus on sentence building and summarization, interacting with the who, what, where, when, why, and how on multiple text types, including written text, video, art even, long-term English learners learn to play with language and vary their syntax. Here are a few frames that we might use to support academic language critical to argumentative thinking, speaking, and writing. These frames or patterns can help students and teachers model how to adapt and expand language. And when long-term English learners see how to apply and adapt them for their own purposeful speaking and writing, this can be a very empowering process. Again, it's demystifying how we use language. The next high leverage practice is to teach grammar and vocabulary explicitly and in context of their reading and writing. We know from the research that one of the most effective and efficient techniques for improving vocabulary is when teachers use vocabulary notebooks across departments and school sites. It didn't show as much of a gain when it was just in an individual classroom, although, of course, for your students, that can show gains, but it's really when you get your whole department or your team or school on the same page. And you don't have to be doing the same notebooks, but you're engaging in the same kinds of processes. So this practice includes an intense focus on academic vocabulary, and it also involves interacting with specific grammar that supports each genre. The last high leverage practice is publishing. And when we say publishing, we mean celebrating or making public somehow student writing. And you can do this in both low-tech and high-tech ways. We know from the research that students who use technology to publish their writing write more, produce better writing, they make more changes, they collaborate more, question more, and improve more. And so there are some examples on here, some common, more high-tech ways that teachers do this, but you can also do this in, I'll show you a picture in just a minute, of writing walls in the classroom or books. Here, you can see an example of a writing wall in a middle school classroom. And when we focus on these 6 high-leverage instructional practices, we become stronger teachers of writing and therefore motivate our students to become self-regulated learners and better writers themselves. The research shows that teacher knowledge is what most impacts writing achievement for students. When we focus on teachers' sense of efficacy around writing instruction, really knowing what is it that we should really be focusing on and doing, how should I be spending my time, we develop as effective teachers of writing as well as teachers as writers. Teachers tell us all the time that they feel that by going through this process and modeling the writing form with their students, that they themselves have become better writers. And educational leadership experts agree that creating expertise among teachers of writing is critical to academic success. By increasing the amount and quality of writing, we hope to support teachers and schools and districts transform their teaching of writing. Because achieving quality learning is the equity and social justice issue of our time.
So now we have time for questions and answers. One question that we just got, Julie, has to do with teaching vocabulary. And does the research suggest that teaching vocabulary on its own works, or does it need to be embedded in a process like a writing process as you're describing?
Yeah, ideally it needs to be within the context. Just random vocabulary words is not the best way to go about engaging students. It's not creating a purpose. We always want to think when we're constructing our units, why am I teaching students what I'm teaching them? And making it, especially for students who have been isolated and segregated from we really want to create these dynamic learning experiences for them. And when they're engaged in high-quality text and they're answering and talking about really intellectually demanding topics, within the context of the reading, the videos, tying in other, art areas or, any other modes of communication, this is where vocabulary needs to be taught because students can see the direct connection. But the random vocabulary, unless you're going really deep into one of those words, but again, it would be a word that is in the reading or in their own writing, and they are really unpacking the word parts. That's what we need to be focusing on.
Yeah, thank you. And we have 2 questions about project-based learning and its connection to English learners. Whether you know of quality resources on that, and do you know of any research showing a link between project-based learning with English learners?
Not off the top of my head. I'm sure there is, and I've read about it. I don't have it off the top of my head, but I know, when I'm out guiding teachers and schools, they're getting trained. It's really about thinking about all of these wonderful practices and trainings and learning that you've already engaged in over the years. And project-based learning, it just completely makes sense. It's inquiry-based for every student. And so when we're engaging students in projects, like, one that comes to mind is, students in a problem solution genre. When students are choosing their own local, real-world problems to address, Like I had a group of students that some were addressing, contamination in the Tijuana River or teen prostitution, or why more Latino students from their school site were not going on to college. And they found the answers, and they interviewed, and they created surveys for parents and students and teachers. And they were wrestling with their project. There was no need to think about how am I going to engage these students. They were delving into the research and the reading and the language involved in their projects. So I could look at that, but I think it really ties in if you think about everything involved in projects and you think about this research on these 6 high leverage practices, it dovetails perfectly. It's about engagement and meaningful experiences and talking about the reading and writing. So I would strongly encourage people to use their backgrounds on project-based learning with their students, with their long-term English learners especially.
Right. Julie, we've got a couple questions earlier, and I wish Leslie were still on the call, because your framework and approaches really do seem to be individualized. But there were a couple questions from educators who are working with, up to 36 English learner kids of all different levels in their classroom. Some people have English learner students from grades 9 to 12 all together, and they, of course, the long-term English learner student population itself is quite heterogeneous. For example, they may have gaps in their education and varying experiences. Do you have anything to say about how to offer differentiated instruction in such a circumstance?
Absolutely. When you're using something like writing and thinking to drive the instructional process, whether you're summarizing or comparing and contrasting, or you're moving from opinion to argumentation, the genre is the genre, the thinking is the thinking, and that's not what changes. So you could even use a similar rubric across language proficiency levels, but where the differentiation comes in is, students do need the text and the reading, a little bit higher than their current level. They need to have that struggle there, but, obviously your newcomers and your long-term English learners are going to be, reading different texts. And the biggest difference will come in during the assessment part. If you're assessing student writing, and this is not for a grade, this is to show growth in writing. If you're assessing through their language proficiency levels, then your expectations of what a compare-contrast piece of writing looks like for a beginner student compared to a long-term English learner, that's where you'll really make those shifts. But you can, absolutely use the writing or the thinking to drive the instructional process, use a similar rubric throughout, and then when you get into that collaborative writing phase, that is where you will group students with similar, not all at the same level. Even what Leslie was talking about with having that apprenticeship model is you can group students for different purposes.
That's helpful. Another question had to do with your guidance on technology-based resources, if you're aware of some, to support oral academic language development?
Oh, yeah. There's tons of resources out there. I mean, I could send you a list of what we share with teachers on a regular basis, but I would say some of the more popular resources would be screencasting and students producing iMovies, their own screencasts, their videos, presentations. Another online resource that, is really motivates students is to connect with students on other sides of the globe through a global learning network. Global Schoolhouse is one. There's a whole, if you just Google global learning networks, you go in and they're free, and you connect with a teacher in Puerto Rico or India and say, I have this idea for this project. Let's compare and contrast teenagers in your country to ours, and, you know, there's students just love that.